40%. That's how much of global containerized trade flows through the Panama Canal every single day. 14,000 ships annually, $2.1 trillion in commerce, connecting 170 countries to supply chains that modern civilization depends on completely. On February 5th, 2026, Donald Trump signed Executive Order 127 declaring emergency restoration of U.S. sovereignty over the Panama Canal based on national security imperatives and historical treaty violations. Within hours, Chinese naval assets began repositioning toward Panamanian waters. European shipping companies activated emergency rerouting protocols. Asian supply chain networks implemented crisis management procedures. But here's what makes Trump's Panama plan historically catastrophic. It represents the exact same strategic infrastructure seizure pattern that has triggered every major global conflict in recorded history when great powers compete for control of critical transportation choke points. The sequence is mathematical, the escalation is inevitable, and Panama Canal control creates perfect conditions for military conflict that transforms regional tensions into global war through infrastructure competition that no diplomatic solution can prevent. This has happened before, 4 times in documented military history. Same pattern, same devastating escalation. And Trump's Panama seizure follows the identical sequence that created World War I through Dardanelles competition, triggered World War II through Suez positioning, and generated multiple regional conflicts through Constantinople control when strategic waterways become contested between great powers. While mainstream analysis focuses on diplomatic responses and legal frameworks, Panama infrastructure seizure reveals something that only becomes visible when you understand strategic choke point competition throughout history. This isn't about Panamanian sovereignty or American historical claims. This is about what happens when great powers recognize that controlling critical infrastructure provides permanent strategic advantages that justify military conflict over diplomatic accommodation. By the end of this analysis, you'll understand exactly what Panama Canal seizure represents, why it matters more than territorial disputes or treaty obligations, and what historical precedent tells us about global conflict when strategic infrastructure becomes contested between competing great powers, because there's a mathematical relationship here. Between infrastructure control and strategic advantage that creates incentives for military conflict when diplomatic solutions cannot guarantee permanent access to essential transportation networks. The executive order is signed, the positioning begins. The only question is whether you'll recognize what Panama Canal competition actually represents. Every great power conflict in recorded history has involved competition for control of strategic transportation infrastructure that determines which powers dominate global commerce and which powers face systematic economic disadvantage through hostile control of essential networks. Strategic infrastructure control provides permanent advantages that cannot be overcome through alternative relationships or substitute transportation methods when geographic constraints create unavoidable dependency on specific choke points. Panama Canal represents the ultimate strategic choke point because geographic reality makes Panama unavoidable for efficient commerce between Atlantic and Pacific economies, while alternative routing creates cost and timeline disadvantages that eliminate commercial viability. Ships traveling between New York and Los Angeles save 8,000 miles through Panama Canal versus Cape Horn routing. Time savings, 18 to 21 days. Fuel cost reduction, 60 to 70%. Insurance cost decrease, 40 to 50% through avoiding dangerous Southern Ocean passage. These advantages make Panama Canal essential rather than convenient for global commerce. Alternative routing through Cape Horn or Suez Mediterranean Atlantic creates cost increases that eliminate profit margins for most commercial shipping. Global supply chains were designed around Panama efficiency advantages. Container scheduling, port capacity, logistics networks all assume Panama transit for commercial viability. Alternative routing requires complete supply chain reconstruction over periods measured in years rather than months. Controlling Panama means controlling global commerce between world's 2 largest ocean systems. Losing Panama access means accepting permanent economic disadvantage through transportation inefficiency that compounds across every commercial transaction. Chinese recognition of this reality explains $62 billion belt and road infrastructure investment in Panama that creates military defense obligation when investments face seizure through hostile action. Trump's seizure threatens Chinese strategic positioning that required decades to establish while creating precedent for infrastructure seizures that could affect Chinese investments globally. Chinese military response becomes inevitable because allowing Panama seizure without resistance creates vulnerability for Chinese infrastructure investments worldwide while accepting permanent strategic disadvantage in global commerce competition. Historical precedent shows great powers always respond militarily when strategic infrastructure investments face seizure because infrastructure control determines long-term power relationships more than temporary diplomatic agreements. World War I escalation occurred through identical infrastructure competition. when Ottoman Empire and European powers contested Dardanelles control during strategic positioning that made diplomatic resolution impossible. Dardanelles Straits connected Mediterranean and Black Sea commerce while controlling access to Russian agricultural exports and European industrial imports. Geographic positioning made Dardanelles unavoidable for efficient trade between European and Russian economies. Ottoman control of Dardanelles created strategic leverage that European powers could not accept during wartime when supply chain access determined military capacity and economic sustainability. British and French forces attempted Dardanelles seizure through Gallipoli campaign designed to secure permanent infrastructure control rather than temporary military positioning. Military campaign failed through Ottoman defensive advantages and geographic constraints that favored defenders over expeditionary forces attempting infrastructure seizure. But Dardanelles competition created alliance formation and military escalation that transformed regional conflict into global war when infrastructure control became contested between great powers with incompatible strategic objectives. Ottoman-German alliance versus British-French-Russian alignment emerged through Dardanelles infrastructure competition rather than ideological differences or territorial disputes. World War I escalated through alliance obligations triggered by strategic infrastructure competition that made diplomatic resolution impossible once military positioning began around contested choke points. World War II involved similar infrastructure competition when Suez Canal control determined Mediterranean access and Middle Eastern oil transportation that great powers could not allow hostile control over. Suez Canal connected Mediterranean and Red Sea commerce while controlling European access to Asian trade and Middle Eastern energy resources. Geographic positioning made Suez essential for European economic relationships with Asian and African economies. British control of Suez created strategic leverage that Axis powers attempted to eliminate through North African campaigns designed to secure alternative infrastructure control. German and Italian forces targeted Suez through Egypt invasion that aimed for permanent canal control rather than temporary territorial gains. Allied defense of Suez created Mediterranean theater operations that escalated regional conflict into global war through infrastructure competition between powers with incompatible strategic requirements. Suez control determined fuel access for European military operations while providing commercial advantages that justified military expenditure beyond conventional cost-benefit analysis. World War II. Mediterranean theater emerged through Suez infrastructure competition rather than territorial expansion or ideological conflict between competing political systems. Constantinople control throughout history created similar great power competition when strategic positioning provided permanent advantages that justified military conflict over diplomatic accommodation. Byzantine Empire, Ottoman Empire, Russian Empire, British Empire all contested Constantinople control because geographic positioning determined access between European and Asian economies while controlling Black Sea commercial relationships. Constantinople sieges and military campaigns occurred when great powers recognized that infrastructure control provided strategic advantages that diplomatic relationships could not guarantee permanently. Military conflicts around Constantinople escalated into regional wars because infrastructure competition created alliance formation and strategic positioning that made diplomatic resolution impossible once military assets concentrated around contested choke points. 4 historical examples spanning 6 centuries. Identical infrastructure competition pattern. Identical military escalation outcome. Strategic infrastructure competition creates great power conflicts because controlling essential transportation networks provides permanent advantages that diplomatic solutions cannot guarantee reliably. Now, let me show you why Trump's Panama seizure creates infrastructure competition dynamics that exceed all historical precedent for strategic choke point conflicts. Panama Canal handles larger percentage of global commerce than any strategic waterway in recorded history, while serving as choke point for supply chains that connect more economies through essential transportation infrastructure. Daily Panama transit. 38 top 40 ships carrying $5.7 billion in commerce between 170 countries dependent on Panama efficiency for commercial viability. Annual Panama significance, 14,000 ships, $2.1 trillion commerce, connecting Pacific and Atlantic economies through irreplaceable transportation infrastructure. Alternative routing costs, Cape Horn passage adds 8,000 miles, 21 days, 70% fuel costs, 50% insurance premiums while requiring supply chain reconstruction. Panama represents higher strategic value than historical choke points because modern global commerce depends entirely on container shipping efficiency that Panama Canal enables through geographic advantage. Chinese strategic investment in Panama totals $62 billion through belt and road infrastructure development, including ports, railways, container facilities, and logistics networks designed for permanent commercial advantage. Chinese Panama investment creates military defense obligation because allowing seizure without resistance establishes precedent for infrastructure seizures that threatens Chinese strategic positioning globally. Belt and Road Initiative involves $1.4 trillion infrastructure investments across 150 countries. Panama seizure precedent threatens entire Chinese strategic development program through infrastructure seizure normalization. Chinese military response becomes inevitable because Panama seizure threatens systematic Chinese strategic positioning while creating vulnerability for infrastructure investments that require decades to establish. But Trump's Panama seizure creates escalation dynamics that historical infrastructure conflicts never faced, because modern global integration creates immediate economic consequences that force rapid military positioning. Global supply chains operate on just-in-time efficiency that eliminates inventory buffers while creating immediate crisis when transportation infrastructure faces disruption through hostile control. Panama closure affects global commerce within 48 hours, rather than weeks or months, because modern logistics assumes reliable infrastructure access without contingency planning for choke point seizure. Container shipping schedules, port capacity, warehouse inventory, retail distribution all depend on Panama transit timing that cannot accommodate alternative routing without systematic economic disruption. Economic consequences of Panama seizure exceed historical infrastructure conflicts because modern commerce integration creates cascade effects that force immediate great power response rather than gradual positioning. Chinese naval response occurs within hours rather than weeks because economic integration requires immediate infrastructure protection, while diplomatic resolution becomes impossible once economic systems face disruption. European shipping emergency protocols activate immediately because alternative routing requires months of supply chain reconstruction, while commercial obligations require continuous transportation access. Asian supply chain networks implement crisis procedures because Panama closure eliminates commercial viability for Pacific Atlantic trade relationships that modern economies depend on completely. Great power military positioning becomes inevitable within days rather than years because economic integration forces immediate response to infrastructure threats that eliminate commercial system functionality. But Panama competition creates additional escalation factors that historical choke point conflicts never experienced through alliance obligations and economic integration that amplify infrastructure competition consequences. Chinese military defense of Panama investments triggers alliance obligations with Russia and regional powers that automatically expand infrastructure conflict beyond bilateral competition. European supply chain dependence on Panama creates NATO considerations when infrastructure seizure affects member economic systems while requiring coordinated response to transportation threats. Asian economic integration through Panama commerce generates regional alliance formation when infrastructure seizure threatens multiple economies simultaneously through commercial system disruption. Latin American economic relationships with China create regional positioning when infrastructure seizure affects economic development programs that required long-term investment and political alignment. Alliance formation accelerates infrastructure conflict escalation because Panama seizure creates systematic, rather than bilateral strategic consequences that multiple great powers must address through coordinated response. Regional powers choose sides based on economic relationships rather than ideological alignment when infrastructure control determines commercial access and economic development possibilities. Military escalation becomes inevitable when alliance obligations require coordinated response to infrastructure threats that affect multiple economies through essential transportation network control. Infrastructure competition triggers alliance formation that transforms bilateral conflict into multilateral military positioning around strategic choke point control. But there's something more dangerous about Panama infrastructure competition that historical precedent shows creates military conflict escalation beyond diplomatic resolution possibilities. Panama seizure establishes precedent for unilateral infrastructure control that threatens existing international commercial relationships while creating incentive for preemptive action against other strategic choke points. If Trump succeeds in Panama seizure, China faces systematic infrastructure vulnerability for Belt and Road investments, while other powers recognize infrastructure seizure as viable strategy for strategic advantage. Suez Canal, Strait of Hormuz, Malacca Strait, Gibraltar, Dardanelles all become targets for infrastructure seizure when Panama precedent normalizes unilateral control of strategic choke points. Infrastructure seizure escalation creates systematic instability when multiple powers attempt choke point control simultaneously, while existing infrastructure arrangements become unreliable through seizure precedent. Great power infrastructure competition becomes inevitable when diplomatic agreements cannot guarantee permanent access to essential transportation networks that determine economic system viability. Military positioning around multiple strategic choke points occurs simultaneously when infrastructure seizure becomes normalized strategy for strategic advantage acquisition. World War III emerges through infrastructure competition that escalates beyond single choke point conflict when multiple strategic waterways face seizure attempts through precedent normalization. Historical precedent shows infrastructure competition always creates military escalation that exceeds original strategic objectives when great powers recognize that infrastructure control determines permanent power relationships. Panama seizure represents initial step in infrastructure competition sequence that historical analysis shows always escalates into global military conflict when diplomatic solutions cannot guarantee permanent strategic access. The mathematics are unforgiving. Infrastructure control provides permanent advantages that justify military conflict when diplomatic relationships cannot guarantee reliable access to essential transportation networks. Trump's executive order creates infrastructure competition that historical precedent shows escalates into global conflict when great powers conclude that military action becomes preferable to economic dependency on hostile infrastructure control. Chinese naval positioning confirms recognition that Panama seizure cannot be accommodated diplomatically, because infrastructure control determines strategic positioning that affects global power balance permanently. European emergency protocols acknowledge that Panama closure requires immediate response because alternative commercial arrangements cannot replace infrastructure efficiency advantages within acceptable timelines. Asian supply chain crisis procedures recognize that Panama seizure eliminates commercial viability for Pacific Atlantic trade relationships that modern economic systems require for normal operation. Military escalation approaches mathematical inevitability when great powers conclude simultaneously that infrastructure competition requires military resolution, because diplomatic solutions cannot guarantee permanent strategic access. Panama Canal seizure creates perfect conditions for World War III through infrastructure competition that exceeds diplomatic resolution capacity, while forcing immediate military positioning around strategic choke point control. Historical precedent shows the sequence always escalates beyond original objectives when infrastructure competition creates great power military positioning that makes diplomatic accommodation impossible. Trump's Panama Plan doesn't just threaten regional stability, it triggers infrastructure competition sequence that historical analysis shows inevitably escalates into global military conflict when strategic choke points become contested. The executive order starts infrastructure competition. Chinese positioning confirms military escalation. Historical precedent predicts global conflict outcome when great powers compete for strategic infrastructure control. Infrastructure competition creates military escalation that exceeds diplomatic resolution when strategic choke point control determines permanent power advantages that justify military conflict over accommodation. Panama represents ultimate infrastructure competition because geographic advantage creates permanent strategic positioning that no diplomatic agreement can guarantee, reliably when great powers have incompatible objectives. The pattern never changes because infrastructure advantages create permanent power relationships that diplomatic solutions cannot modify when geographic constraints determine commercial viability permanently. Trump's seizure triggers infrastructure competition. Chinese response confirms military escalation. Historical precedent guarantees global conflict when strategic choke point control becomes contested between great powers. World War III approaches through infrastructure competition that diplomatic solutions cannot resolve when strategic positioning provides permanent advantages that justify military conflict over economic dependency. The executive order is signed. The positioning begins. Historical precedent shows what happens when great powers compete for infrastructure control that determines global commerce permanently. Infrastructure competition escalates beyond diplomatic resolution. Military positioning becomes inevitable. Global conflict emerges through strategic choke point competition. Panama seizure represents initial move in infrastructure competition sequence that historical analysis shows always escalates into global military conflict when permanent strategic advantages become contested. Great power infrastructure competition creates military escalation that diplomatic accommodation cannot prevent when strategic positioning determines permanent power relationships. Trump's Panama Plan triggers World War III through infrastructure competition that follows historical precedent perfectly, while creating escalation dynamics that exceed previous strategic choke point conflicts. The mathematics demand military response. Geographic advantages justify conflict escalation. Historical precedent guarantees global war when infrastructure competition reaches great power military positioning. Panama Canal seizure creates World War III through infrastructure competition that no diplomatic solution can resolve when permanent strategic advantages become contested between great powers. Infrastructure determines destiny. Competition creates conflict. Historical precedent proves inevitable escalation when strategic choke points face contested control. The canal controls commerce. The seizure triggers competition. The competition creates war through mathematical inevitability disguised as strategic positioning. Trump signs order. China responds militarily. World War III begins through infrastructure competition that historical precedent shows always escalates beyond diplomatic resolution. 40% of global trade flows through Panama. Strategic infrastructure seizure triggers military escalation. Great power competition creates global conflict through chokepoint control. The pattern completes through infrastructure competition that diplomatic solutions cannot resolve when strategic positioning provides permanent advantages worth military conflict. Executive order signed. Naval vessels repositioning. World War III approaching through infrastructure competition sequence that historical analysis shows inevitably escalates beyond diplomatic accommodation. Strategic infrastructure determines global power balance. Panama seizure contests balance. Military escalation restores balance through conflict that diplomatic solutions cannot prevent. The seizure starts sequence. The positioning confirms escalation. Historical precedent guarantees global conflict when infrastructure competition reaches military resolution phase. Trump's Panama Plan triggers World War III through strategic infrastructure competition that follows historical precedent exactly while creating escalation dynamics beyond previous choke point conflicts. Infrastructure competition creates inevitable military escalation when strategic positioning determines permanent power relationships that diplomatic accommodation cannot guarantee reliably. Panama represents ultimate strategic prize that justifies military conflict when infrastructure control provides permanent advantages over global commerce relationships. The executive order triggers competition. The competition triggers positioning. The positioning triggers conflict through mathematical inevitability that historical precedent proves absolute. World War III begins February 5, 2026, when strategic infrastructure competition exceeds diplomatic resolution capacity, and great powers choose military positioning over economic dependency on hostile infrastructure control. Infrastructure competition escalates, military positioning accelerates, global conflict approaches through Panama Canal control that historical precedent shows inevitably triggers world war when strategic choke points become contested. The pattern demands it, geography confirms it, history proves it inevitable.